Good evening. Welcome, everyone, to our session. This is what theology looks like: public ministries of resilience and solidarity, a celebration of Eden Seminary and the progressive Christian movement. I'm your host for this evening's session. I'm Reverend Dr. Dietra Wise Baker. I'm the visiting professor of community engagement here at Eden and the director of contextual education. And appropriate for this session, I'm also an organizer, lead organizer of MCU's Break the Pipeline campaign. And tonight we have the opportunity to live into that intersection of faith and the public square. And the session is called Good News versus the Infowars: Theology in the Public Square. You're going to hear an exciting conversation between me and my comrades who do work not only as faith leaders, but also in movement spaces in the public square. I'm going to be joined by the Reverend Michael Addy, the Reverend Marion Edmonds Allen, the Reverend Nelson Pierce, the Reverend Dr. Cassandra Gould, and the Reverend Deborah Patterson. For those joining us by Zoom, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to greet one another and to make comments during the presentation. And for those who are joining us out there in Facebook land or accessing this at a later time via a recorded session, please use the Facebook comments to greet one another and to comment. Again, welcome to this night of spring convocation and to this session, Good News versus the Infowars. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to another celebration of spring convocation at Eden Theological Seminary. I'm your host for this particular conversation. I'm Reverend Dr. Dietra Wise Baker. I'm the visiting professor for community engagement and the director of contextual ed here at Eden Seminary. And this week we've been talking about this is what theology looks like: public ministries of resilience and solidarity, a celebration of Eden Seminary and the Christian progressive movement. And this segment is Good News versus the Infowar. So I want you to just join me in welcoming our band of public square folks from the Eden community, alumni and guests, as we plumb together sort of Eden's presence in the progressive Christian music movement. And I want to celebrate that each one of you are exemplars of that intersection in beautiful and radically different ways, as we'll hear today. I want to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Cassandra Gould, the Executive Director of Faith in Action, the Reverend Marion Edmonds Allen, who is the Executive Director of Parity, a New York-based nonprofit working at the intersections of faith and the LGBTQ community, Pastor Nelson Pierce of Beloved Community Church in Ohio, the Reverend Michael Addy of the United Congregations of the Metro East, an affiliate of the faith-based community organizing work DeMayo, and State Senator Deborah Patterson of District 10 in Salem, Oregon. Thank you all for being here with me this afternoon. So excited to talk to you about the torch that you're carrying. Help us locate you in the public square.
Our work at Missouri Faith Voices is we're multi-faith, we're multi-race, and nonpartisan. Statewide, the only faith-based statewide organization in Missouri. And being a multi-issue organization, all of our work is centered in racial equity. We're really compelled by our faith and all of the strains that faith comes in. And so this year, particularly, our work is focusing on just democracy. As we know, there are many fights around the right to vote. Um, I was contacted most recently by reporters about what was happening in Georgia and had to name we didn't have much to take away in Missouri around voting. but there are continuous attacks on how we vote and barriers such as photo ID. In the public square, some have deemed me pastor in the public square as I left the pulpit to just be in the public square. Um, my work locally is around democracy. It is around reducing gun violence in the city of St. Louis. Happy to work with other Black-led orgs, especially Kayla Reed at Action St. Louis, Jamala Rogers at Organization for Black Struggle, and others who do that work with a Black hermeneutic of liberation. Um, my work across the state is around making sure that those who would be deemed the least of these and left out of democracy have access to the ballot box and have the political education that they need to transform their communities. And in the public square nationally, my work is around making sure that HR 1, which is the People's Act, specifically focusing on voters' rights, as well as HR 40. I want my 40 acres and a mule, or whatever the contemporary version of that is, reparations, and also consult with my national network on international work. Right now, it is making sure that there's equity in vaccine distribution in Ghana and making sure they have what they need as well. And so that's who I am currently in the public square, and connecting judicatories as well as congregations to the work, helping them move from being just observers of what's happening in the public square to actually being participants and leaders.
Thank you. And I'm so glad to be here and to be on this panel with these fabulous folks. I work at the intersection of faith and LGBT, and my joke is that wherever I go, I scare someone, because perhaps I'm talking to a group of faith folks and they may not realize that I'm LGBT, or perhaps I'm talking to a group of LGBT folks and they don't realize that I'm a clergy person. So either context, I can just see the fear. But what I am is this human bridge between what so many people think is this insurmountable divide. And I'm the person that says, you know what? I am an LGBT person of faith, and being a faith person informs who I am as an LGBT person, and being an LGBT person informs my faith. So I work to, in the public square, I work to model how we can come together across what seems to be divisive issues. I work in religious freedom settings. I work in business settings, because I found that the business community is really forward thinking in terms of faith and LGBT. And I work a lot with young people, because they're the ones that see that you can be both, and they're the voices that will continue to push this movement forward. So I'm a proud Eden alum and a Demon student as well.
The work that I do in East St. Louis, and I started working, became an executive director of United Congregations of Metro East in 2019, before I was their lead organizer. The work that we do specifically focuses on two counties in Illinois, Madison and St. Clair County, and that includes the cities of East St. Louis and the surrounding suburbs of those counties in Alton, Illinois. And we are part of the Gamaliel Network, nationwide network, and we're also part of Gamaliel of Illinois and Iowa, which is a two-state network with affiliates across both of those states. And some of the work that we're doing, we work on issues of social justice and racial justice, but everything that we do is through a lens of racial equity. So we have currently three major pieces of work that we're working on. We're working on environmental racism, environmental justice. East St. Louis has for decades been a dumping ground for environmental racism, lots of toxic things in the ground. We're fighting an incinerator plant right now. We're working with a statewide coalition to pass the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which would bring resources to communities, environmental justice communities like East St. Louis, to make sure that they get in on the new green economy, right? So oftentimes people of color are often left out of that conversation. So one of the things that we've been a proponent of is making sure that people that look like me and you and brown folks are at the table when we have these discussions about environmental justice, because they are disproportionately impacted by environmental racism. We also do school to prison pipeline work. So we work in the educational systems in all the school districts in the Metro East. We are also working on, we're developing what we call in Gamaliel Expo Network, which is ex-incarcerated people organizing. So we're organizing people around the criminal system. We leave out the justice because there's not a lot of justice in it, but the criminal system. And so one of the things that we just recently got passed was in the state of Illinois, we got a bill passed to end cash bond in the state of Illinois. So we're one of the first states in the United States to end the use of cash bond in the criminal system to hold poor people in jail because they can't afford $1,000 to get out, right? So we ended that, and that is supposed to take effect in 2023. So now we're working to defend it against the narratives that the other side is pushing out and trying to scare senators into rolling back this great change that has happened. So we focus on working in those marginalized communities and organizing not just people of faith. We've expanded our reach to include people who are not necessarily part of an organized institution of religion, but maybe they just there's some good people who want to do some work around justice. So we have a way for them to also join our organization and participate. And so we've been focusing on expanding that base in the state of Illinois. I know a lot of times people think Illinois, oh, that's a Democratic state. That's where Obama is from. But Obama's from Chicago, which is blue, and the rest of the state is red, which is where we operate at down south in southern Illinois. And the rest, anything past I-80 is all considered southern Illinois, and it is most definitely red country. So we find that we still have to be that voice, right? Crying out in sometimes what feels like a desert, but we know that God is listening.
I want to say thank you so much for being invited to be here today. And hello to everybody at the Eden Convocation. Wish we could be there in person, but blessings to our new president, Reverend Dr. Deb Krause, and grateful to all the faculty and students there for your continued leadership in progressive Christianity. Honored to be here with these voices speaking out for justice. I think I would just add in my journey is that the learning for me has been that one's ministry continues to unfold throughout one's life. When I left, I started out hoping to be a hospital chaplain and work at St. Louis Regional Medical Center, which was had a profound impact on me. The health inequities I saw there were horrendous. And if anybody's still able to do any research, I want to just shout out that there were so many hysterectomies done on African American women there that I'm very concerned about what happened there. So if someone's willing to look into that, who's still in the area, it would be an important piece of research, I think, to be done. Somebody's got to speak up for what happened there. What I saw was horrendous. I then went on to serve after I graduated from seminary to a small church in that Southern Illinois area, and saw people falling through the cracks in the health system, losing their spouse and being at risk of losing their homes, not being able to navigate the health system, not being able to afford things. The disparities were huge. And so I decided to go back to school, studied health administration at Washington University, and felt that was still a ministry. I maintained my standing because I knew that speaking up for justice and healthcare for everyone and speaking up against the disparities that I saw was really important. So from there, I went on to Deaconess Incarnate Word Health System I was on the senior management team there. And that was one of the places where people were treated with dignity, just no matter what their health insurance status, and everyone should have health insurance. Everybody should have equal access to affordable health care. So continue to go on, move to the Deaconess Foundation, and shout out to Reverend Starsky Wilson, who is now the executive director of the Children's Defense Fund. So grateful for his work that it came in the years after I was there. Moved on from there to run the International Parish Nurse Resource Center, where around the world I worked with nurses and saw the ministries that they were doing to try to get people access to care. And the disparities between other countries, as you mentioned, Dr. Gold, Ghana and Kenya, they're so far behind. 30 countries have no access to vaccines still yet today. So it's not right. So continued on that fight. We moved here to Oregon. We live in the capital city of Oregon. And after, I know that our work needs to be bipartisan or nonpartisan or whatever, but I am a Democrat elected to the Senate seat. And I was so appalled by what I saw happening with the Trump administration, when they got into power, and all the racism and sexism and all the isms were on full display for all the world to see. And I was like, where are the ministers? The church, the evangelical church, a lot of folks had supported them, particularly white evangelical churches. So as a white person, minister, I had to stand up. So that's when I ran for office in 2018, lost, ran again, and 2 years later, and here I am, because I'm fighting for access to healthcare for all. And it's all healthcare. It's all health. Housing, it's health. Education, it's health. Poverty, it's health. So, that's why I'm doing this. I feel it's practical ministry, and I'm grateful to Eden Seminary. I'm grateful for all the years and all the steps along the way, and my colleagues here. Thanks.
I am, as Dr. Baker said, the pastor of Beloved Community Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, where we worship a God who shows up always and everywhere on the side of the oppressed, and then lean into that worship to follow the call and the movement of God out into the streets or into the public arena. And so we are trying to show up as best as possible, and always better on the side of justice and on these issues that are pressing towards us. Also, I am bivocational. I'm a bivocational pastor. And so my tent making job, I'm so blessed and privileged that it is aligned with my passion. And that is that I work for Democracy for America. And so my job is to plant and water grassroots organizations in each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia, which we hope will be our 51st state, to move a progressive agenda and to support progressive candidates as they run for office. And so it is the church and the religious side on one hand, and the work in politics, and particularly helping to support people running for office on the other.
I think some people would, still bristle at, what is the role of a religious leader in movement space, period. And I think we could definitely talk about, Ferguson, I think was a shift, or at least a moment where folks began to realize that progressive movements don't have to come from the church, or they don't have to be initiated by some religious entity. And so I'm curious, definitely to hear you, Senator Patterson, and you, Dr. Gould, just talk about, well, given, that factor, what is the role of a religious leader in the progressive Christian movement in places that may be secular? Also, Reverend Marion, in movements that don't necessarily have religious language or faith at the center of those movements.
I'm still a pastor at Smyrna United Church of Christ. It's a rural community here, and I'm on a 6-month leave while we're in session, but they encouraged me to have a public voice. It's our role. And progressive Christianity, as Nicholas Kristof pointed out this week in the New York Times, started a long time ago. He said it started with Jesus, who was speaking up on behalf of the poor. And so, to me, there's no separation. Yes, I believe in the separation of church and state. I'm not, but I think that my faith, as did President Obama's faith, and did, as does President Biden's faith, compels them to work for justice. So I don't know. What do you think, Dr. Gold?
So I believe that part of the role is for us to reclaim our space, right? I believe that over this past year of being forced out of the building, I don't believe God caused the pandemic, but I do believe being forced out of the building was the providence of God. If you know, Phyllis Tickle talked about the rummage sale that happens every 500 years, and so we found our organs and our and Black church tradition. I'm an AME preacher, pastor, so we found our praise team all out on the curb, and I believe that that's where it should have been in the beginning. My DMin project from United Theological Seminary, only the second best seminary because Eden is the best, was beyond the walls, right? And that's my ministry, my now virtual ministry. And so I believe that the role has always been, if we really want to follow the model of Jesus, as we take even the journey to the cross, the biblical lynching tree, it was about being in the face of the establishment. And so I am at home in the public square. I'm privileged that in many cases, some of my, obviously leading a faith-based organization locally, and in my national work, I am showing up mostly in places that dare to operate in the intersection of faith and politics. I do a lot of work on predatory lending with a group of actually not so progressive Christian folk, but they at least care about that. And so I'm usually in the room of an example of what it looks like to actually live your faith out loud, what it looks like to put something at risk. I believe to be a religious leader in this moment in history, and if we dare call anything progressive or even a movement, it means to put something at risk, to have your reputation on the line, to have your body on the line when necessary, to move away from that which has bound us, whether it is, physical bondage to buildings. I built one, and I was actually glad to actually leave it. Or it is the traditions, the traditions around our silence, the way we have misinterpreted separation of church and state. And so I usually show up in the room sometimes to let those who work in secular space to know that the church does have something to say, that the church has a role in movement space. Sometime, and I know we'll talk about Ferguson in a little bit, but it is space to remind folk that they are church as well, that they have not been excluded from faith despite what tradition may have taught them. And so we have a role. We have to continue acting in that role, and not just to use, in the words of our beloved and overused phrase from Dr. Walter Brueggemann, not just use our prophetic imagination, but actually demonstrate what resistance looks like in the public square. We are so beyond, as we are mourning these losses, just another shooting on last night and last week. The church is no longer the place where we just produce thoughts and prayers. We have to actually produce the manifestation of Christ, which means we show up, as Reverend Nelson said, on the side of the oppressed, on the side of the road, in the neighborhoods, in the hood, where other folk, including not politicians like Senator Patterson, but where even politicians don't go.
What Dr. Gold said, I mean, that was so beautiful. I completely agree. I'm often in spaces where there aren't other clergy folk, and absolutely LGBT organizing spaces where faith can be really scary is a space, but also I do a lot of suicide prevention work, and I do a lot of work around LGBT youth homelessness and homelessness in general. And it's surprising, but in both of those spaces, depending on where you are in the country, there aren't a lot of faith folks. And I seem to say over and over again to my clergy colleagues and people of faith in the pews, please show up. If you have a heart for a particular issue, whatever it might be, your voice as a person of faith, your presence there speaks volumes more than you may realize. Because I think in a lot of spaces where there's a lot of progressive action and activity, faith can be seen as like perhaps an afterthought, or okay, those folks aren't here. But we are there in our hearts, and we need to be there with our bodies and with our voices. We need to be writing op-eds. We need to be running for office. We need to be in all of those spaces, and we need to be speaking up. And especially now where so many folks think of Christians as just a certain type of person with a certain type of political perspective. Well, that's not true. So it's up to all of us to get out there and to speak up and to write and to be there.
My next question, I think that naturally follows this is, everyone doesn't have the benefit necessarily of being able to go to school for a few years and, learn what they think and why they think it. I want you all to take a minute and, just talk to the average person who's in the pew and the various traditions that we represent and don't represent. What is grounding? What's your justification? That's how I'm going to say it, because that's how people come, I think, and people who sort of live at these intersections. Like, what is your justification for theologically, spiritually, for being able to lead a congregation this direction, to be in the public square? You've gotten to some of that, but I'm wondering, Reverend Addie and Reverend Pierce, if you would take some time and help people get some theological grounding, some justification for why is this possible? Why do we live this way? Why do we have these values? Where are they coming from?
I am a Baptist, and my church is dual affiliated with National Baptist and American Baptist, and one is slightly more progressive than the other. But yet both are still rooted in some very traditional theological constructs. And I think for me, being a more progressive preacher, teacher, I think for me, the reason that I stay within the denomination, within the church, because my church is Antioch Baptist Church, shout out to Antioch. And it's an older congregation, a more historical congregation in the St. Louis metro area. And the reason that I stay is because we can't afford not to have them in the fight. And so I come into the space of the traditional church, the church that I've known all my life, and I come in and with a certain amount of conformity so that I can contest, right? So that I can push back and create the tension that's needed in those congregations around issues of racial and social and gender justice. Because if we don't, we run the risk of being, found guilty of casting away a group of people that have been the solid foundation and rock of many congregations before we became progressive, before we began to hear God speak in different ways and move us in different directions. There was this solid foundation of the church, my grandmother's church, right? My mother's church. And so therefore I remain so that I can hold the tension, so that I can contest. Like there has to be a certain level of contestation. So I introduce, sometimes to my own detriment, I introduce progressive thoughts and progressive theological constructs that sometimes get me in trouble. I had a member call the pastor on me and say, "Did the preacher say that God was evil?" Because I was forcing them to think I pushed the congregation to think about what does justice mean from the perspective of the folks who were already in the land of Canaan before the Israelites got there and took it, right? That's a strange concept for, for them to think about. And it was not to impugn God in any way, but it was to get us to begin to think that there are perspectives that are not heard. And so I think for me, um, understanding that, and some of us remaining in in that space to hold that tension. We need more people to do that.
I would say what grounds me most is the life and ministry of Jesus, and how what Jesus does in the biblical text is what I am trying to do and emulate. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' first sermon, Jesus talks about opening blind eyes, preaching good news to the poor, the release of prisoners, all of these issues that are now part of a progressive agenda are issues that Jesus spoke about in his first inaugural sermon. Jesus, in his ministry, gave divine pardon on a death penalty case. Jesus picked up the gaps of where the healthcare system had left people by the wayside, that Jesus' entire ministry was focused on people who were not at the center of political life in favor or religious life of the time, but people who were on the margins, who were left out, who were ignored. And so that is the work that that I feel called to do, and feel that the work both in the church, in moving the church out into the public arena, but also working to elect people is a divine responsibility. That Jesus existed under an empire. And so the work that Jesus did was to teach people to resist the false narratives, the lies, the fake news broadcast by the empire. But we live in a democracy. And you can't convince me that if Jesus were not born in somebody's hood here in the United States of America, that Jesus would not be teaching people to use their voice and get out and vote in a way that made the government live up to the responsibilities that it's supposed to have to make sure that people are fed, people are properly educated, that we have health care for all, that nobody is left out, that we are not trampling on the rights of our LGBTQ folks, that this is what Jesus did in his ministry. And so we can hold the system accountable for doing that in a democracy.
What Reverend Nelson said for sure. But in addition to that, as a Black woman in this work, right, as a Black woman in the church, I find my grounding in different places. When I matriculated at Eden, we had something, I think it was merely called orals, right? And you had to be able to orally articulate all of these things. And one of the questions was, who is the theologian that most resonates with you, that informs your theology? And I walked into that room as scared as I could be, but confident in the theologian. I had an 8 by 10 picture of my great grandmother, Roberta, because she was my theologian, right? Her with her 8th grade education from Demopolis, Alabama, but she gave me a sense of what Black women particularly call, and Black people in general, somebodyness. I understood who I was, and I understood whose I was. I'm grounded in that. In the last 3 years, I've been blessed to take 3 trips to my beloved Ghana. I know that I should have, if they had not stolen us from my land, that I was an Ashanti princess. I know that to be true. So it is grounding in the ancestors, right? It is this sense of being so connected to the pain of the past, but also grounded in what we call Afrofuturism. This sense of also being connected to the future and knowing that I have something to live up to for those who made the way before me, and also knowing that I have something to leave for those who will come after me. In her book, Too Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength, Dr. Shanika Walker Barnes says the church encourages Black women to keep others' vineyard while neglecting our own. She goes on to say the church does it in 2 ways: by venerating our performance of strength, and depending upon women's labor and our financial support to maintain the church without providing equal opportunity for us to exercise our gifts in ministerial leadership, and by distorting scripture in a way that encourages suffering and self-sacrifice, especially for Black women. And so even in progressive movement spaces, Black women are those who are unseen. Black women are those whose ideas are not often validated, whose voices are not heard. They're the ones in the community who are suffering in silence, whether it's with COVID or something else. And so I am grounded in a sense of purpose and call that keeps me connected to all of those things and reminds me that what Jesus did and my embodiment of that as a Black woman connects me to my grandmother who made a way out of no way, and helps me to try and make a different way with hopes that my children, my 7-year-old granddaughter Lotus, who says, I like to fight and I want to be a preacher like my grandmother, like Nana, will not have to fight the same fights that I am in. So those things ground me.
I'm hearing some markers of the progressive Christian movement as a vocation of risk-taking, as a vocation of resilience, as a vocation of solidarity with the poor and oppressed. I'm thinking about Pastor Pierce's reflections on Jesus, and as I sort of scan through the Testaments, I see a ministry of healing. I see a ministry that rebuked demonic activity. We got to do something with them demons, okay? That is clearly a part of, it's clearly a part of Jesus's work to do something with them demons. In our time and place, I think somebody might call that white supremacy, and that at least a mark of the progressive Christian movement has to be some speech, some performance, some work, some resistance around white supremacy and rebuking those demons and all their intersecting cousins. And that finally Jesus does some recruiting of the marginalized. And so there, and so as I think and hear some of the work, right, it's not helping, which we're organizers in this room. We don't help folk. We organize folks. And so looking at the ministry of Jesus as a tool, as a way of recruiting folks to the team, that the folks that are on the margins become the folks that are at the center. This is why we organize formerly incarcerated people. This is why we organize the mamas who get the bailout. This is the reason, because the power in the movement comes from them and through them. And so I want to bring all that energy and that fire to this conversation about Ferguson and this coup and the good news versus the info wars. Folks are struggling to see straight about what's really happening. I'm hoping maybe in this next question, you all can help us with our vision. Help us to see what does resistance to white supremacy look like from your seat in the public arena?
I'm gonna own my own work, and then also invite others to think about their work. So in my work, especially for myself and for as the pastor of the church, it is to rid myself of the vestiges of white supremacy that I have embraced in my seeking to embrace a Christianity that was separated from its origins. In other words, the Christianity that America gave to me is not the Christianity that my foreparents worshipped in and celebrated across the ocean in Africa, that was birthed and nurtured there. And it's not the same Christianity that my foreparents in the southernmost regions of the United States saw as they moved to liberation themselves. But I was given a whitewashed version of Christianity that I have had to separate myself from and disentangle from, so that I could feel the message of Christ claiming me as authentic in all of my Blackness, in all of my heritage, and not demonize my past or my heritage because it don't look like everybody else's. So that's been my work and the work of the church. I would also invite some of my progressive white friends and colleagues and family members who are wrestling with their place in this to consider that maybe the best place for you to be is not to be trying to proclaim that Black Lives Matter, all right? And maybe the most important place you can be is to be out there with your friends and family members and cousins who are on the margins of white society, for whom nobody is speaking to or talking to other than people who are trying to exploit them for the political capital so that they can make themselves rich at their expense. Walter Brueggemann told us this was coming back in 2014. I was with him in a room, and he said that because we have so many white progressive spaces that are trying to embrace this middle ground and push their own and talk about white supremacy, they are ignoring the pain of white people who don't see themselves as having any kind of privilege, because the same system that is oppressing poor Black people in the hood is oppressing poor white people in rural areas. And somebody's got to be out there and preach a progressive message to them. Talk about what Jesus looks like in rural white areas, what Jesus looks like that wants healthcare for people out there. What does it look like to preach a Jesus in a city, in a town where the factory's closed and nobody has work? What does a progressive message look like in those places?
It's the same as Nelson's around that. Not a popular opinion, right? Because folk want to show up as ally and solidarity. Tamika Mallory recently said accomplices, and I got in trouble sending that quote out on a email blast, and white folk who understand, they're like, oh, but accomplices is like being criminalized. We know. We exactly know, and we want you to feel like that too. And so, yeah, we got that. Now, this might get edited out, right? So Nelson gave you the Black church sermon version of it. In 1984, Andy Young used a phrase, and it's just a quote. He talked about in movement spaces, smart ass white boy science, smart ass white boy theology, smart ass white boy movement, science, tradition, mode of operandus continue to show up. It shows up in the church because we are much more comfortable living in this space that was created even by white theologians who risked nothing, who shed no blood. We talk about what it looks like in the streets. It looks like it's radicalized in the streets. In organizing, the first revolution is internal. Folk in the streets have been close enough to the blood of Black bodies. They've seen the blood of their children, their siblings, their classmates, their cousins, their uncles, their mothers, their fathers. They've seen that blood shed. In the church, it looks like blessed quietness, holy quietness, because we might say just a little something. We might have the reason in some traditions, and I don't mean this disparagingly, but maybe I do, that we have to have Social Justice Sunday is because we haven't figured out that the whole book is social justice. That to preach the gospel is to preach a gospel of social justice. And so it looks like the church is still on mute. It looks like you come out in the streets, you declare Black Lives Matter, you make yourselves feel good because you order the banner, right? But still, you also know the cousins that you have who are also the ones who made their way to DC, and you don't say anything to them from the pulpit or even at the table when we can gather again safely for Thanksgiving. So it is a matter of doing our own work, right? Being able to do our work, to operate in our lane. We know Black Lives Matter because I stay awake at night. My son is real grown, right? My daughter is real grown. Still, he lives, they both live in different cities. He lives in a different state. I still like want to know when they got home because I know that their Black lives are always vulnerable. And no matter how people try to be in solidarity, they'll never actually know that, right? And so the church has been so impacted by politics, by terms that are used in politics and etc. We sometimes act more like politicians and keep things politically correct. And I believe that we are called to be disruptors, and Jesus disrupts death. He disrupts even his own. And so we are called, if we're not disrupting death, which also means in movement spaces, smart white folk have to move out of the way, quit being gatekeepers to the money coming in, quit being gatekeepers to the positions, quit being gatekeepers to those who are organizing and being organized. When we were organizing in Ferguson and we had white churches who we want to come, you cannot knock on doors in Ferguson with me. You just cannot do that. You go talk to your people, and I will get people who live in Ferguson to talk to their people. And so we just gotta like agitate each other and do the things that we need to do so that we show up as our best selves in whichever lane God has given us to operate.
I'd like to just add a word because I have to hop off in about 1 minute for a housing committee. But from my point of view, to address white supremacy, and I'm working in and living in a state that said that you can't live here if you're Black when the state was founded in 1859, and if you wanted to stay, you would have to put up with being lashed twice a year until you finally left. And I'm living in a town where you were not allowed to stay overnight. You could come here during the day and do some work if you wanted to for somebody, but you better get out by the end of the day. So a lot of work to be done here indeed. And I really appreciate what Reverend Pierce said about speaking to our neighbors. And so that's why I'm working on housing. That's why I'm working on healthcare. That's why I'm working on, the things that are going to help us all, because I can't be a leader in the Black Lives Matter movement, but I can speak up when the Spirit says speak about the injustices that have been going on for centuries, and that we can 400 years of a legacy in this country has left a burden on this land, and we have to speak up. Jesus was a person of color, and he is my savior, and I'm listening. So I'm trying to speak and do as he calls. So I am so sorry I need to hop off to get back to the legislature, but I'm so glad to see you all.
What are your dreams? What are your visions? What are you excited about?
Dr. Baker, I'm really excited about the 80% who aren't, they're not extreme on one side or the other. They're the ones that are like, okay, what can I do? How can I help? They're the ones that the info wars are trying to push one side or the other. And what I'm seeing out there with my Blessed by Difference work is these folks really want to dig in and find out what's what. And then they want to do what they can in their lane to be helpful. So what I'm excited about is that there's been a sea change that I'm seeing. I'm seeing rural white churches now saying no to their pastors who are homophobic and racist, and saying, no, we don't want to be part of this. Either you change or we're leaving. I'm seeing this over and over and over again. I think people have had enough and they want change in the world and they want to be part of it. And that brings me great hope.
Now we just finished some training campaign around this program called Healing Illinois. And what we're doing is examining implicit bias and microaggressions, because I think that some of the work, where we work on at the institutional or the macro level, that there is some work that has to be done at the micro level, right? So we engage a cross section of the folks in Illinois who we work with, which is Black, white, Latinx, Asian, and bring them together to begin to do the internal work of dealing with implicit bias and microaggressions in a way that brings healing, right? We work to remove the scabs, and create the space where people can be authentic. And um, we don't do safe spaces, we do brave spaces, right? Because some of the things that people share in these spaces may trigger you, uh, may trigger me. Um, but in those moments when we feel as though we want to lean out, we encourage people to lean in, because it's only when we can hear truthfulness and handle the pain of the truth, which, Black people, we deal with that all the time. But working with white folks and other people of color to be able to express the truth and the pain of it, whether you have been part of. So, part of the questions that we ask are, when have you been part of a microaggression? When is a moment that you uh, that you have oppressed or you have been oppressed? When was the first time you became aware of race, right? Those questions that cause people to reflect inward so that they can begin to do the work outward in an honest way. We're also working to develop a Race and Power Institute across our network, um, because there's an intersectionality of race and power. Like, a lot of the things that we talk about in the frame of organizing deals with power. A lot of the things that we talk about in electoral language is about power. It's power flows through every relationship. If you're a mother and a child, there's a power dynamic there, right? So oftentimes we don't explore power in ways that give us clarity around those power dynamics. If you're a preacher, and you're the pastor of a church, there's a power dynamic between the pastor and the parishioner and the members. So we want to explore this intersection of race and power and all of its facets. And how do we begin to explore that work and open it up and unpack it so that we can then begin to heal and become a balm for healing in the nation, in our communities. Um, and so I'm excited about the Black Healers Collective in St. Louis that I'm a part of, that we're looking at ways and methodologies to begin to bring healing into a community that is so traumatized, that experiences trauma sometimes on a daily basis and never has avenues to unpack or express or to deal with that trauma. We're excited about bringing more Black people into environmental justice, because oftentimes we Black folks is fighting on so many fronts. Like, we fighting to feed our children, we fighting to get to work, we fighting to have a job, that oftentimes we're ignored, or people think that Black people don't care about the environment, but we are people of the earth. We the first people of the earth. And so it is in our DNA to care about creation. And so so we're excited about recruiting and bringing more Black folks into the environmental justice space, because you said earlier, Reverend Dietra, that um, we have to, um, I lost my train of thought, but you said something earlier about, bringing people into these spaces and creating these spaces um, that we are traditionally kind of left out of, that there's no voice for us. And so that's the work I'm working on right now. That's the work we're working on. How do we begin to reach out to the marginalized, right? And I'm interested in not just making the marginalized the center, but I'm talking about taking the center out to the margins, right? And working at the margins with the marginalized, uh, and then leaving the center for Jesus, leaving the center for God, so that we are all in the margins with the marginalized. We all become the margins.
I say this in all sincerity. I have continued hope by the continued presence and work of Eden Theological Seminary. One of the reasons after I graduated, I was so thrilled to be invited to join the board was because it's a privilege to be able to help steward the institution that puts out such great thinkers and practitioners, people who live this work out in such powerful and profound ways. And so that continues to give me hope um, to see the work that young people are doing, not just in the streets, but the way they are taking that energy in the streets and creating, bringing new leaders into power. To see what's happened in St. Louis since Ferguson, where there's a new prosecutor, where Bruce Franks and then Rasheen Aldridge became state representatives, Cori Bush in Congress. God willing, right around the time this broadcast, Tashara Jones as the new mayor of St. Louis, to see these people who are representing progressive values get into office, a lot of it on the energy that was created out of resistance to the murder of Mike Brown. That gives me such great hope. The fact that Georgia, the place that banned Ray Charles from singing because Black and white people, because he dared to stand up and say that Black people shouldn't be relegated to the back of his concerts, to see that state elect Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff into the Senate in this contentious time gives me hope. And so just to see the places where even amidst the tragedies that are happening, that there are these moments, these grace-filled, joy-filled moments that remind us that it's not all tragedy, this continues to give me hope.
I'm excited about Missouri Faith Voices. I've been here about 5 years. We are babies of the bunch. We turned 10 this year. I'm excited that we've grown from an organization that I was the only employee to having staff all over. Excited that we are now looking towards organizing in Kansas City. Excited that Medicaid expansion finally passed last year. It was the issue that brought our organization together when preachers from across the state got together to form this organization. And in just about a week, we'll be hiring a Black healthcare advocacy organizer, somebody that will work specifically and only on the issues of equity in the healthcare system in Missouri. Excited about collaboration amongst the grassroots organizations in the state. I chair a table comprised of grassroots groups. Excited that those who didn't always have a racial equity clue are actually naming it now and examining themselves and trying to figure out how they actually hold themselves and peers accountable to that. I am saddened by gun violence, but excited about this opportunity that's coming together through Faith in Action, through our Live Free work, and many other partners across the country. We're asking demanding the Biden administration to put their money where their mouth is around reducing gun violence under Fund Peace Now. There's been a little bit set aside for it, but we're asking for $5.3 billion. And if you're listening, you can go to fundpeacenow.org and actually sign on to this, whether you're an org or an individual. We know that too much blood has been shed. And I'm excited that we're using our imagination, like my brother, Reverend Pierce, excited about young people, watching young people matriculate from being protesters in Ferguson to being politicians and leading organizations and being organizers. Excited about the opportunity in this moment that the church has to really not just get off Zoom and go back into the building, but to actually, we've been forced beyond the borders of our own imagination over this past 12 months. And I'm excited about what could be for the Church Universal, what could be for those of us who operate under the liberative banner of progressive Christian movement, what could be for the Black church, how we might reposition ourselves for the sake of liberation for all. So to do this work, to be a Christian, to be a Black woman called by God to preach and to lead, I have to drop my anchor in a place that is filled with hope. And at my core, I'm a hope dealer, and I'm excited, despite all of the obstacles, about the opportunity to spread hope in places that we have not dared to go.
Thank each of you for this time together. Eating community, this is what theology looks like. These are the practices of resilience and solidarity shared by our colleagues and friends in the Eden Network. And we ask you to continue with us in this celebration this week of spring convocation of Eden Seminary as a partner in the progressive Christian movement. God bless. Thank you all for participating and sharing in your comments on Facebook and here in the chat on this session of good news on the InfoWars, Theology in the Public Square. We invite you to reach out to anybody any of the panelists that shared with us today. If you're looking, I think some profound things were said. And as a practitioner in the public square, we mean what we're talking about. And so we're just waiting for you to link up, to connect with us, to continue to live out our values in the public square. We are asking you to sign up. There's a form in Facebook or here in the chat. It is a survey. We ask you to take some time and fill out that survey so we can continue to produce programming content that is effective and helpful to the community. This session will be available on Facebook and on the Eden website. And we finally invite you to join us in the final convocation worship tomorrow at noon as we celebrate the Senior Preacher Award recipient, Corey Lovell, and we ask you to come and celebrate with Corey and the community from which he comes, and to celebrate Eden and its work and the progressive Christian movement. Thank you again for being with us tonight. God bless.